Good evening, Andy. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Musa. Good to
How
see
are
you.
you?
Good to
Good
see
to
you.
see you.
Very well. Very well. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good. All
Thank
the
you.
best for seeing you. Yeah.
Oh, very kind. Likewise. Well, impromptu, really. I reached out to you a couple of days ago or a few days ago, and you kindly agreed that you were free this evening for an hour or so for a dialogue. So recently, I've reached out to a few colleagues and comrades locally to have a conversation and share that with the public. And I thought it'd be good to reach out to you, but I wasn't sure what your diary commitments were. So thank you very much for making that available this evening. So yeah, I want to go into dialogue, what that means to you, how social media is negatively impacting dialogue and stopping, a deeper conversation from taking place, particularly in this day and age when it seems so important. But also to go into spirituality, as you know, that's very important to me in terms of my interfaith interest and interfaith spirituality. I'm interested in your thoughts about that. I take you to be a man of faith, and how that influences you in your outlook, as it were. I'd be very interested to get close to that as much as you want. But before we get into the dialogue in more deeper conversation, the last 24 hours has been very distressing, with the events developing in the news. Very painful to watch, and picking up anger on social media with the events that have unfolded. I was heartened by seeing your tweet that came out yesterday evening about the absence of sensitivity and compassion. Could you speak to that and why that's so important at this time, particularly, Andy?
Well, I think we've got to understand the context. Obviously, there's been this horrific murder in London of Sarah Everard. But of course, the outpouring of grief and upset is broader than the terrible event itself. And it's because 50% of our population don't feel safe. And we've got to understand that. It's very difficult to, well, not difficult, but it's two men having a conversation about something that impacts upon women and girls. And as the father of girls and the grandfather of girls, it brings it home to me just how painful this is. It is an absolute aberration that our society is developed in a way where women do not feel safe on our streets, and that is just totally and utterly unacceptable. So I think when we see the response from the community, it's a very human response, and it's a cry of pain, of anguish and anger that people cannot carry on with their lives as they would wish, with that freedom that they are entitled to, in my view. And I think everybody would share that, but that's the reality in every town and every city, and we've got to understand why that should be so. But in terms of the events of last evening, I just thought that was so tone deaf not to facilitate and permit that expression, and that expression of anger and solidarity and the determination to secure change. And it becomes more complex when we see that in the political and legislative context, because tomorrow there will be a bill before Parliament that will deal with many things that the vast majority of people want to see by way of making the environment safer for so many people. But fundamentally, it attacked a basic human right and need to express oneself and to protest. And I just couldn't believe how wrong the Metropolitan Police got it yesterday. in imposing themselves into that space, given all of the sensitivities that were at play. We had a police officer in custody for the most heinous of crimes. And I think it was incumbent upon the police to allow that space for people to go about the quite understandable and human response of acknowledging this dreadful death out to the family and expressing solidarity with each other. And I think that was a mistake. But where there's errors are made like that, there's also a learning experience to be had from it. And certainly that's informed people's attitudes towards the proposal that expressions of protest be restricted. We cannot do that in a supposedly civilized society. The ability to express oneself in a peaceful way is a fundamental tenet of our belief system, as it were. It's part of our democratic adherence. If we lose that, then we are in grave difficulty. So it's been a hugely complex 24 hours, but it has brought to the fore so many powerful forces that I think we've got to step back a little and just take in what all of that means. The reality is that people, women and girls, are fearful for their own safety. That cannot obtain. And we've got to change that fundamentally, and also have the ability to protest when the cause is just and the cause is right, as it is in this case. But quite frankly, it provokes a more difficult discussion around us having a judgment about causes that we deem not just and not appropriate. That's intrinsic in the principle of freedom of speech. And so we must tread with great care. So I think it's been a really thought-provoking 24 hours, to say the very least. But I think an awful lot of people are deliberating on these events over the last 24 hours.
No, I'm really grateful for that, Andy. I didn't want to ignore that question because it's brought to the fore the absence of all those things that you've talked about that's created that event yesterday. And I also thought some of the stuff I was picking up on social media, those images that went across the world, basically, particularly of intervening in that way. I mean, you look at protests in Hong Kong, you look at the protests that are happening in Myanmar. I mean, you think of the tank man at Tiananmen Square. I mean, I'm making great leaps here, but the power of protest is so important universally across the planet. And it should be under no illusions and under no threat in this country in particular. So yeah, I'm really grateful for what you said there. One of the things my father used to say was, or reminded me from the commentary you're just talking there, and the case also that's happened today with Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe being charged again for another issue. Prior to the Iranian Revolution, I understood the Shah of Iran, or the regime, used to forbid people gathering for more than 2 or 3 people at a time at a cafe because they didn't want people talking. You know, even gathering in that informal social way was considered an act of dissent in a very, very small way, but, you know, to allow no speech. So these are great arcs I'm talking about, but they're all connected on that one same, I suppose, psychic field. You know, we need to make sure these things are protected, and I'm really grateful for irrespective of the issue. You know, that can be something else, but the right to protest against injustice, whatever one feels, for me is a very deep thing. It's not a material thing. It would be a spiritual thing. So thank you for that. And just continuing the dialogue theme throughout this conversation, we'll mention this several times, but with the pandemic, I mean, bringing it more to the last 12 months as a constituent MP, as a member of the Shadow Cabinet, but particularly as a constituent MP, one of the ways I appreciate you with dialogue would be face-to-face surgeries, you know, constituents booking appointments, and that conversation well, being restricted really, and finding that very difficult. How are you dealing with that? How are you coping with
Mm.
making yourself available for conversation, for dialogue, as well as answering questions and queries? And how is that happening these days?
Yeah, well, it's worked incredibly well in all the circumstances, but it's not as we would wish. We don't have an office open where people could just come and attend and make an inquiry of staff when I'm not there, or book appointments to see me in my surgeries. That simply can't happen. So for these many months, we've been working remotely, and I've got to say that has worked as well as I think it possibly can. Um, I had a surgery on Friday, and there was a number of people attended. Um, and of course, the first thing you've got to deal with is the technology. Now, not everybody has access to technology, and those that have may not be that particularly adept. I don't profess to be particularly adept, but some people don't have that familiarity with the environment. So that presents difficulties, but we manage with telephones, with Zoom, with all the other techniques that are available to us. That works very well. You can imagine that we have never ever been busier, because not only has the pandemic thrown up innumerable inquiries, and we've gone through all the phases from school closures and returning to school, businesses closing down, having difficulties getting support, self-employed people having those difficulties, and you name it, any manifestation of COVID and the problems it throws up, it's come through our virtual door. So we've been dealing with that. But in addition, the ordinary business, the non-COVID business, that people come to us with all manner of issues, and if you can think of it, it will come to us. And that has continued apace. So the staff who work for me have been absolutely in top gear right from the off, and we've managed to work, and we're the same as everybody else. We're all feeling somewhat detached, and it's not as we would wish. But I've got to say that there's a great deal of dividend here in terms of the productivity. I think everybody will observe this. We're certainly not spending time traveling between venues. I'm talking to people. But the downside of that, of course, is you just simply don't get that human interaction. And you can do your very best, and people are either, got different abilities across these different mediums, but it's no substitute for actually sitting in a room with somebody, because the communication is more than just screens and words and the rest of it. We've got I can't put my finger on it, but if you're sitting in a room with somebody and having that exchange and conversation, you get a lot greater intimacy in the conversation, a lot more understanding. It can be a little clinical, to say the least, but nevertheless, the business has to be done, and we've made sure that we've progressed it. And I think we'll probably use some of this for the future. I think that this does present opportunities, actually, and people do say that the home working issue, the remote working and virtual working, has moved on probably between 5 and 10 years in 10 months, and I think that's right. But there can be no substitution for personal contact. But we'll have to incorporate some of this. One of the problems we have is that people who are being asked to work from home, quite rightly, that actually presents some complications, because it's their home, it's not their workplace. And so we've got some thinking to do about how we adapt to that environment, and what are the obligations there, because it can become incredibly intrusive if we can just expect people to be constantly at work. So it throws up some questions, but we've worked efficiently and well through this, but I think, like many people, will be glad to have the option of doing things in the usual way. Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll return to some form of that kind of normality. I don't know what the new normal
I
will
hope
be.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting that you're mentioning about the absence of being in person, face to face. Something is missing, a bit clinical, on the internet here. Um, I guess listening to you there, a degree of trust, something that would spontaneously arrive in a meeting face to face. People speak more freely, or they can sense something saying, well, I'm going to say this, I wasn't able to say it before. And maybe there's a degree of confidence by being in person rather than being online, I suppose. So, yeah, interesting. Those thoughts popped in my mind as you're talking there. But just moving on a little bit now into the purpose of talking to you today, really, is to get into a bit more abstract kind of conversation, if that's all right. Dialogue itself, and I thought maybe it would help just to share a few thoughts what dialogue meant to me at Apex. I'll ramble a little bit, so forgive me for that. But please, please butt in or ask for clarification if I'm doing that. For me, ultimately, the peak of dialogue is an inclination or a turning towards or a transformation towards the good, whether one may call it the common good or something, but it is a movement away from distance to maybe unity or whatever, but it is something inner that you are moving towards. And in particular, when two people are conversing, whether it's face-to-face or online or in person, and I think that invisibly for me, true dialogue or leaning towards true dialogue would be along the lines of where the individuals hold each other in trust, invisibly, they would support each other in that dialogue. And the purpose being to aim towards better understanding, whether it's a seeking for truth, whether it's humanistic truth or religious truth or scriptural truth. But there's an interaction, there's a relationship, whether it spontaneously happened and it falls away, because the dialogue has ended. But for me, dialogue is spiritual. It can take its place in the world that you work in terms of obviously public service and at your station as a shadow cabinet member. But yeah, for me, dialogue is going in that direction. And if it's a mere exchange of information, then I think it's just a mere aberration of dialogue. It's not real. And I wonder if the public instinctively picks up on that, particularly in politics. I'm not being spoken to, I'm being spoken at. I'm not being asked my opinion to respond, I'm being just told to take some sound bites in.
Sure.
And I don't know if we've reached a point where that's the end of the road, really, for that kind of approach. And dialogue is a way to go through. So please, Andy, I'm interested.
Well, I think it's multifaceted and incredibly complex, because I think when you quite rightly describe dialogue as the pursuit of good and the establishment of trust, or the development of trust between parties, I think that's absolutely right. And you'll certainly not gain an understanding or gain a consensus unless those things are in place. And I hate to be transactional about it, but in lots of ways, that's one of the reasons I think, certainly many people from my side of the House of Commons and from a party perspective, come into the labour and trade union movement, because they want to see that progress, and it is a shared ambition. It wants to be pursued by way of discussion, by way of listening, understanding, and agreeing a way forward. But I think for me as a politician, that is something I wholeheartedly believe in, but I do recognise I come hard up against forces that actually will not want to engage in that. And so it's my job to persevere and try to encourage people to do it. But it's often expressed in terms of power. Power in the community, power in the workplace, if there's an imbalance and it's an asymmetrical relationship, then it's very hard to persuade the person in possession of that power that the giving up, the release of that power and sharing power is actually mutually beneficial. And so it's a fascinating area of discussion, because we've got to engage, otherwise we will not make progress. But we've also got to be persuasive of, and I put it this way, the moral case for embarking on that journey and securing that consensus and shared objectives. I've got to do it in this way because two things are linked: the moral imperative and the economic outcomes. They're absolutely directly linked. If we continue down the path of inequality and insecurity in the community, in the workplace, economically, that just becomes more and more skewed, leading to more and more human pressures and tragedies. So it's a fascinating concept, but it actually goes to the heart of what drives people politically. And you can see where those lines may blur at times between stated political ideologies. But there are other times when it's abundantly clear where there are different interests at play and different motivations. So it's a very complex area, because you're not just talking about this discussion that would go on between what you would describe as adversaries, but you're also talking about the broader conversation that we're having in our homes and in our communities, which is the much bigger concept, and the one ultimately where progress is made.
Fascinating there, Andy. As you were talking there, sort of something clicked in my mind. I maybe hadn't thought about it before, but if you come to the dispatch box as you do as a Shadow Secretary of State and make your case, it's an adversarial context, isn't it? Really, you're dealing with an opponent who does not believe at all whatsoever in the values and ethos that you're espousing. You know, whatever that is, without getting. This is not a political conversation. We're not going into that, but the public often says, why don't they get on? Why don't they talk to each other? Why don't they, just work together? The usual mantra. But I think it does need pointing out that some things are not really meant to be worked together. They're meant to be confronted. They're meant to be.
Well, they are. Just look at our public services, our National Health Service. For me, that's an expression of socialism, and there is a religious connection with that in my view. That's how I construct things. But people come to socialism from all manner of routes, from all religions and from none. But that's my route in. But if I've got that objective of trying to address the needs and making sure that people are treated with respect, with dignity, and with a sense of equality, that may completely conflict with somebody else's view of the world, which will be, no, this is about survival of the fittest, and it's about who can get the most, and the devil can take the hindmost. Now, if you get into that situation, you've got a direct clash of ideologies and philosophies. Now, as I say, you can find where that blurs, and some progress can be made, but you do come hard up against that. I mentioned the National Health Service. If we look at the panoply of public services, what are they there for? They're for the public, the common good. And what we have had constructed over the last many decades is an economic architecture that seeks to extract value from those services for the benefit of corporate entities and shareholdings. It is not about the service itself. So we fundamentally have diametrically opposed views. So trying to build a conversation in that sort of environment is extraordinarily hard. And there comes a time when politicians, engaging as they do, have to offer a lead and offer a vision.
Yes.
And it's the old quandary of signpost or weather vane. Which are you? And I think if we can be, of course, listening, of course, engage, but with that, develop a very clear path and establish those signposts, I think that's the right way to go about it, and it's what will ultimately appeal. And I think any failures that we've had over the last many years are in my view, because of the absence of that engagement and that understanding and that lack of clarity. But I think, because I'm forever the optimist, that things, they are changing. So I think we watch the next several months and years with great interest. We don't watch, we participate, we engage. But I think the time is right for a different way of engaging and structuring our society for everybody's benefit, not just for the vested interests of a few.
Yes, I'm glad to hear you speak in that way, because particularly about vision, weather vane, and signposts, etc., very important these days. Because I often am curious at the moment how anyone, slightly judgmental, and forgive me for that, but to anyone listening, but I don't know how in this day and age you could not have an opinion on something. You know, with everything that's going on, the neutral road seems to be, difficult. I appreciate it's not always people aren't always able to engage, but generally the choices before us are quite stark, and it decides picking, an option and articulating that. And I suppose internally within political parties and also within society, dialogue is a sharing of power to create that vision, as it were. Dialogue is through which you do it. Yes, you need a leader and lead to do so, but doesn't dialogue help to knit?
Well, I think you hit upon the quality of the dialogue, and quite frankly, I think a lot of it is reduced and traduced far too regularly. It's the motivations behind the engagements we have, the dialogue that does take place, are often commercial or driven by. Take, for example, our print media. A lot of that has gone to online. And what is the deciding factor? What's the determinant? It's about clicks, people accessing information. So it's just putting an attractive product there that will gain people's attention to engage them in a commercial environment. And the same goes to our broadcast media in far too many instances. It's there to entertain and grab attention, and it's a conundrum that I have to wrestle with all of the time. I won't mention his name, but I was in a Radio 4 studio with a very significant figure in politics over many decades, and he openly admitted that the object of the exercise was to be as confrontational and as controversial as possible, and be loud as you do it, to gain the attention of the watching public. And I just think we have so gone so far down that road that really concerns me. There is little opportunity for proper exposition of any thinking or indeed examination of any evidence. Certainly no intention to engage in any educational process whatsoever. It's all incredibly thin, and we grab at that and exploit it and run with the mood that creates. And that is disastrous in my view. I'm not expecting great theses at every turn, but we could start with more respectful and better conversations than we see. Certainly, if you look at social media, how that translates. I have to walk that tightrope every day. It's perfectly proper that I communicate and put out my position so that the people who elected me know what I'm saying. But of course, you'll appreciate that immediately, and the immediate response to that is sometimes favourable, but some of the comments that will come back at me are just horrendous. Now, I understand some of that. You may have a different political ideology. We live in a pluralistic society. That's fine. But the degree of unpleasantness and disrespect and the challenge of people's motivations for entering into public life, I think is corrosive, and it isn't going to get any better anytime soon. But it's a problem that we need to better resolve. But it needs to impact upon all communication levels. And I probably picked the wrong profession to come into it if I expected people to be kind, respectful, and polite. But it would be a nice change.
You're welcome. Yeah. I don't know if you knew what I was going to do, but in terms of my thought process, we've gone exactly the kind of direction we wanted to in the next sort of step of this conversation. And that was to continue the social media thread that you've picked up, particularly the impolite, the adverse, and I'm being very courteous here, the downright objectionable kind of commentary that you receive, and trolling and so forth, but just that whole culture, that subculture that's developed around the infrastructure of social media. Whether these things were set up for the best of intentions, I'm sure they were, but somehow human nature has found a way to pollute it in the worst possible way. Which leads me on to ask about this, and it's algorithms. Well, I'm not going to get into the technicals of algorithms because I haven't got a clue what they are, but we've heard the term and how certain data feeds get pushed onto certain timelines, and the more you click something, the more you receive your own echo chamber and so forth. The algorithmic effect on Brexit and how that debate happened, and where all those bots came from, etc. So I don't want to go into all of that, but I'm just saying it for background and context about algorithms. But there is another algorithm, as I was thinking about this conversation to have with you, which this technical algorithm, this computing algorithm sort of feeds off, and that's human nature. We never talk about that. We never go into the personal responsibility and how that is being exploited by and finding root through these mediums, and why that is happening. How do we deal with that? Because one response is legislation, but that's problematic because you're erring onto freedom of speech, you're erring onto protest, all that kind of language. So I'm on about personal responsibility, accountability, as well as tempering and leaning on our better angels, as it were. This development, What do you think about all of that, and particularly how you face as a high-profile individual these days?
Well, on the high-profile individual aspect, let me say at the outset, we started this conversation about the abuse and discrimination that women suffer every day of the week. And I've got to say that my high-profile female colleagues receive a deluge of abuse, which I just think the people who engage in that I really struggle to understand how they think they could possibly justify what they're doing. If they think about their own family and their own sisters and their mothers, would they really accept that that sort of behaviour it should be tolerated? I will have people say things to me about my good friend Diane Abbott, and I have to stop them because I know what is behind what's being said. It's terribly rude. It's misogynistic, and it's often born of racial hatred as well. So, but there is a permissive. There appears to be an atmosphere now where this is acceptable. We have gone back over. I remember growing up as a child, and I think back, I look back at horror at the cultural references, the what we thought was comedy, and it was sheer misogyny, sexism, and racism, and it was mainstream. And I thought we were heading away from that, and the trajectory was only in one way. I think in recent years, and certainly some of the political events, we don't need to get into them, but they have given rise to such tensions that it's just spawned this outpouring of bile and hatred. And I think we do have a major issue on our hands. How we deal with that, obviously education from the outset. Look at what's happening to our young people. When you and I went to school, people could bully, they could punch, they could kick, and that goes on. And it was horrible and painful for a lot of people, and who suffered terrible discrimination as well. This has gone on to another layer because this level of abuse invades people's lives permanently through a mobile phone or through a PC. And that's into the bedrooms of every young teenager in the country. And how that impacts upon that generation's mental health, I shudder to think what the totality of that is. But I know that it's absolutely endemic in our society. So education, without shadow of a doubt, always, I think as human beings, we're always better for standing in the shoes of somebody else and understanding their position. Some of the, obviously Facebook, Twitter, and the rest of it, they've got to look to themselves in terms of how they regulate and control what they do. But ultimately, of course, we do have to think about a legislative approach to that if these things are not effective. And at the moment, I see no signs that there's any moderation of this or any appetite genuinely for moderation. Twitter closed down Donald Trump after he's set off incendiary remarks that almost brought down the government in the United States. But does it have to get to those levels before there's some sort of moderation? We see it in our local newspaper websites where people will contribute. They'll think nothing of saying the most vile things about somebody whose opinion they disagree with, and they only have to see the person's name to automatically set off a volley of abuse. Now, I recognize, and I'm told regularly by people who know more about this than I do, that more often than not, that's not even an individual. It's a bot that's actually firing these vile responses off. And that is a huge issue, and it's beyond my wit to know how you would deal with that. But that comes from political will. And if it's coming from a political environment, then I think there's the ability to have a discussion about how we self-regulate those activities, because this is corrosive. This is actually, not only is it doing personal damage to individuals, it's undermining our very democracy. The stakes could not be higher with this. So I'm desperate to see progress being made, but there are a number of responses to this issue, but it's up to everybody to play their role. It's not going to be done for us. There's going to have to be some self-regulation about this and persuading people why that should be. Sometimes people do have to be brought up short and have to face the consequences of what they've done, and for them to be persuaded. Then so be it, quite frankly, if that's what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't go on like this, because it is ultimately so damaging to us as a society.
Yeah, I think the way I respond to all those important themes that you're bringing up, and challenges and problems, I think we're at the precipice of something worse. We think we've got to the peak of it, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And reminding of the dialogue, how we started tonight, and you alluded to it, it's reminded me how we met. The first time I actually met you was at Joe Cox's
That's right.
great get-together that we had in the park here a few years ago. It was the first time I met, tragically under those circumstances, but it just shows how things are progressing the wrong way. And I'm quite proud of the ladies and women that turned up yesterday to exercise their democratic right, making no comment about COVID and all the restrictions, but just that desire to peacefully acknowledge, well, it was a vigil, to be honest, and it was meant, that's what it was for. But in terms of how we counteract it, I think the only thing I can think of instantly is figures such as yourself, anyone who has a prominent role in society. And by prominence, I don't just mean an official role in government or an elected official. I mean any community individual at whatever level. Speak up, use your voice, change the tone, and try and turn the tide to what's going on. I think being silent is not an option.
That's right.
Particularly with what's going on. So I think that is something that can happen very quickly. It doesn't need legislation. It just needs your own conscience and willing to share that power.
Well, we've learned this, haven't we, Moose, over the last well, not just learned over the last year, but it's become more of a dominant theme, that it's not ever enough to simply say, well, I don't hold with that. That's not where I am. Actually, the responsibility is to challenge it where it emerges. So be that misogyny or racism, you actually cannot abrogate your responsibilities by saying, well, I don't do that. That's not who I am. You've actually got to get in there and make a difference. And you do that by challenging people and holding them to account. I think that's absolutely right. But I think in the it's not holier than now, because, I will fail, do every day. But in terms of engagement, I like to think I consider what I'm saying, and sometimes that can be stilted. I accept that, but I'd rather do that than just simply throw out remarks off the cuff. You've got to be authentic, of course you have, but that authenticity doesn't have to be expressed by being offensive. Mm-hmm. And I just find that is far too prevalent as the first tool in the box. It's just to hurl an insult, be abusive, and be horribly critical of somebody without ever addressing the fundamental issue. So I think if people in prominent positions, if politicians and community leaders adopt that is something to bank. But I regret to say not everybody signed up to that, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't persevere with it. Stick to it.
No, absolutely. We're trying. I think one of the reasons I'm trying to do this is just a small drop in the ocean of social media. There's nothing more to that really, but also just to hold up an example of how when people want to talk and engage, they can have some meaningful discussion and try and take that further outside of that dialogue. So hopefully this will continue. I don't mean this format, but just more widely dialogue in society. Moving on to spirituality. You mentioned it earlier in reference to socialism. I'd love to hear more about that. If you could elaborate that, please, Andy, how that feeds into your socialist outlook, as it were. But prior to that, can you speak about spirituality, your faith? I understand you to be a practicing Catholic in the sense of why that's important to you, and how, you know, critical that is to your core, as it were. That's my perception. If I'm wrong, you know, please guide me accordingly, as it were. But can you speak to that and what spirituality means to
That's I think, Musa, that's what roots you. And when we're born, we don't we've no control over the culture or the family into which we're born. But it, and you know, you can accept the established religion into which you come into as a child, or you can find your own way.
Mhm.
Both things are equally legitimate as far as I'm concerned. But I think again, what I told you before, I think it was just the whole tenor of the political discourse in this country so jarred with me when, you know, as a child being brought up in the Christian tradition, there were certain values that were held out as being the ones that were desirable and the ones that we should follow.
Mhm.
And I saw that so abandoned and abused, certainly in terms of treating one's neighbour as oneself and trying to ensure that there was a commonality of purpose. I just didn't. I didn't see that at play. I saw the exact opposite. And I think I mentioned to you when Margaret Thatcher recited the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi from the steps of Downing Street. That was actually the spur for me to enter politics or become engaged in politics, because I thought, you know, what's going to happen now is the exact opposite
Mhm.
of light where there is darkness, hope where there is despair. Um, I thought that's what I believe in. I think that's exactly the sort of society I would like uh, to encourage. But the political forces at work are going to take us off in the other direction, and under the guise of those principles that they're not restricted to Christianity. You and I both know that these are common themes across all religions and none.
Mhm.
Um, but it really pained me that beautiful expression was going to be so twisted and abused in pursuit of political objectives. And as I say, that's what encouraged me. But it's what roots me. I think I have a very great sense of place and an understanding, hopefully, of my own community, but where their roots are from all over this planet, and that it's one of the joys for me that I was lucky enough to be born into a town where everybody came from somewhere else. It was nobody was, you know, there wasn't somebody saying, "Well, we've lived here for 500 years as a people, and therefore it's our land, and off you go." Well, nobody has. So I think that was so. Those two things sort of impacted upon me, but very much the expression of treating your neighbour as yourself was something that has stuck with me all my life, and I try to adhere to it. Probably fail.
Well, I'm in the same boat. Any seeker, you know, whatever their path is finding their way. You know, I think you meet people along the way, and that's very important. Yeah, I think I'm so glad you brought up about St. Francis. I wrote about that prayer, a very moving and powerful prayer. It sort of speaks to you really, and even though when you're not reciting it, it was my father that introduced me to the prayer, and it became a part of my spirituality, coming, you know, from an Islamic background. And you know, Francis went over to meet with the Sultan, you know, during the Crusades, and who knows what that engagement was at that moment. To, you know, monotheism meeting each other in that dialogue, and now centuries later, you have Pope Francis, you know, visiting Iraq, and you know, encouraging, fostering. Where it goes, we wait and see. But talking about interfaith dialogue, you know, and I think that's for me, that's a good sign. Where it goes, time will tell. Yeah, I think it's really important. Also to share prayers and not to take up, I mean, you may not want to take up another person's prayer, another creed's prayer, but I think the Lord's Prayer is very important. You know, it's a very powerful piece of recital that can awaken you to something greater, whether it's a spiritual mode or something beyond yourself. And equally, I would ask, in an interfaith phase, for my Christian brothers and sisters to look at maybe other traditions' prayer. I would say the Surah Fatiha in Islam, or the Gayatri in the Hindu tradition, whatever it may be. But I think coexistence, if it's to go anywhere, cannot be just in its own echo chamber. There must be individuals who are, meeting each other. Whether communities move or not is a different matter, but certainly individuals can. And I think that gives me a lot of hope. But to end our dialogue, I leave it with you. And if there's a piece of writing or a piece of inspiration you want to conclude with, and then also any concluding thoughts about spirituality. But over to you, Andy.
Yeah, I think on that last point, one of the downsides of this dreadful pandemic and us all being trapped in our homes, that we've lost the opportunities to engage. And I think you and I have spoken on a number of occasions about how we'd really want to progress that, because that's so important in our community. And I look forward to getting back to that soonest. I want to just conclude with a short poem. It's an edited version of a rather longer poem, but it speaks to sort of the eternal struggle, really. And whilst it's a poem that people will be very familiar with from the wonderful Maya Angelou, and there are some specifics in the longer version, I think it speaks to all people who have suffered discrimination and alienation and marginalization, and I think it just speaks to the human spirit in a beautiful way. So if that's all right, Musa, I'll finish with reading that. As I say, there is a longer version of this that people will be familiar with, but I think this is quite opposite.
Over to you. Thank you, Andy.
Okay. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides. Just like hope springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. I rise. I rise. I rise.
Thank you, Andy.